Dr. Adam Sowards is Professor Emeritus of History at University of Idaho. He has, after a long and fruitful academic career, he's now moved on to, he's a freelance writer, and he's got lots of other kind of, irons in the stove, as it were. If you're interested to learn more about what he's doing now, in addition to his recent book, Making America's Public Lands, which he'll be speaking about today, which is for sale in our gift shop, by the way. He's got a website, adamsowards.net. Is it just adamsowards.net? Yes, he's got a lot of great stuff on there. He's also got a Substack newsletter where if you're just wanting to hear from him on a regular basis and some of the writings he's doing, you can subscribe to that. Information's on his website, and it's also right there. So, but he is the author of Making America's Public Lands. He's also the author of the award-winning book, Open Pit Visible from the Moon? Is that what it's called? Pretty close. I didn't bring my notes here, so I apologize. And another one, The Environmental Justice, which is about William O. Douglas, correct? Okay, yes. And, but you've got the information in front of you. I don't have the information in front of me, so you know. But without further ado, please give a Minnesota welcome to Adam Sowards.
Thank you, Jacob. It's a delight for me to be here. I've always enjoyed my trips to Minnesota. There haven't been many of them, but they've always been wonderful, and this trip has been the same. And thanks for spending some time on a Saturday to come out here and listen to me talk about history. I hope it is fun, and I hope you learn something along the way. In a time of political polarization, the choice to walk away from our neighbors is easily made. Yet the choice to stay is essential in a democracy. And I think staying can reveal common ground. And the ground that I've been most interested in as a historian is public land. The writer and environmental activist Terry Tempest Williams describes a meaningful moment in her book, The Hour of Land, A Personal Topography of America's National Parks. Representatives from a dozen Southwest communities and organizations sat around a table. They gathered there to discuss protecting land in southern Utah. Separate parties drew maps and then shared their visions and hopes with each other. What we quickly recognized, Williams related, was that we all wanted the same thing, and that the boundaries we had drawn separately were closer together than anyone knew once we gathered around one common table of concern. One common table of concern. It's a good guiding metaphor that brings to mind, for me, a similar one by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. In her book, The Human Condition, Arendt theorized how the public realm functions in modern society. The metaphor she deployed is helpful to understanding public lands and is a frequent touchstone in my book and the remarks that I'll share here today. To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it, she wrote. The world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time. A table allows people to gather without falling over each other, she wrote. It allows people to be seen and heard from different approaches and positions, each with their unique perspective on the thing that gathered them there. Gaining admission to the table does not mean people give up their identities or their interests, because what is held in common is not those identities or interests, but what brought them together, the table, or in this case, the public lands. People who depend on public lands in myriad ways maintain their separate positions, but see public places from their distinct vantage point. In other words, if we want to understand the public lands, we need to see them how all who have had stakes in them have seen them. And that's all of us. I like to use this table metaphor to suggest the lands themselves as the table around which a public gathers to observe and to consider. And here's how the history unfolded in a really broad way. The initial period saw an uneven audience, and even the table kept shape-shifting. Soon it took a more solid form with a few powerful people running the meeting. In time, the size of the table and the audience grew, and with that growth came new perspectives and ideas to be considered. A result of that growth was even more people offering quite distinct ideas that challenged the traditional way things were done. And for those who had long done things that way, this new conversation felt challenging and even threatening. And soon, the table no longer appeared round, but long and narrow, and people could not see everything or everyone anymore. Attention, then, could not be drawn to the same object any longer, which was the very thing Arendt said was necessary to see reality and take political action. This is the crisis we now face. We shout across a divide rather than focus attention and productive energy on shared space. So for the next 45 minutes or so, I want to take us through some of this history, zeroing in and out of time. I've chosen 5 moments, one from each of the chapters of my book, when ideals were expressed or challenged, and in each of them, the public looks different. Their demands, their hopes, reflect the passing stream of time. To explain how the nation created the system that now comprises 640 million acres, we must go back to the people who have been on the land since time immemorial. That is to say, the territory that the public land system gathers together began as indigenous land. We should remember that the public lands were always Indian lands first, whether Dene or Anishinaabe or Nimipu. This is the foundation on which all else I describe rests. I want to begin with the Homestead Act. For it to make sense, we need some background, though. John Locke, a 17th century English philosopher, provided the key American colonists used to unlock a continent. Locke saw nature as originally held in common. In his view, when an individual applied labor to nature, land turned into property, held exclusively by that individual. This framework furnished the intellectual justification for colonists, while ignoring that the property they were acquiring came from dispossessing indigenous peoples, and that the labor was provided by African slaves. Thomas Jefferson took Lockean ideas and gave them a distinctly American voice. A series of land ordinances passed in the 1780s helped solve the problem of what to do with the continent's land. Jefferson drafted the first one and inspired the rest. Collectively, they etched Jefferson's ideals into practice on the landscape itself. Most importantly, the 1785 law established a survey system where government surveyors would divide up American land into square mile sections that would then be sold by the national government. A simple enough function, perhaps, for a government, but it marked a significant watershed. So in the table metaphor, the tabletop itself is the land, and this era after independence, from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to buying Alaska in 1867, focused on getting a larger and larger table. And acquiring the territory was meant to promote virtue, independence, and economic growth, all qualities that Jefferson invested in the idea of working one's own property. Although Congress passed dozens of laws to shift the public domain into private hands, the Homestead Act of 1862 remains the largest in our political and cultural imagination. It is, as it were, the centerpiece of the table. Homesteading rested on the idea of improvement, a term that possessed both legal and symbolic meanings. Most simply, for legal requirements, improvements for land being homesteaded meant settlers built fences, a cabin or home of some sort, planted crops, things like that. Wilderness or raw land stood incomplete. It needed to be improved, even redeemed. Adding improvements to a farm meant the farmer could stick it out rather than having to strike out for new land. Improvement offered signs of permanence. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Republicans in Congress aimed to build policy that supported what they viewed as a proper society grounded in free labor as opposed to slave labor, and free land as opposed to aristocratic plantations. Abraham Lincoln became an ideal vehicle to extend the Republican ideals of improvement across the nation, and secession furnished the opportunity. Once voters elected Lincoln in 1860, Southern states began seceding. This allowed the Republican Party to pass long-stalled legislation to advance a social vision with land transformation at its heart. In 1862 alone, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act and the Land Grant College Act and authorized the creation of a cabinet-level Department of Agriculture. Those measures were necessary arteries, but the heart for the people beat with the Homestead Act, a plan that quickly turned the public domain into small farms. With bipartisan support and popular favor, the law passed on May 20th, 1862. The law was so popular in part because of its generous terms. For heads of household, the law provided 160 acres to citizens or those who declared their intent to become one. The land would be free as long as the homesteader lived there for 5 years and improved it, or actual settlement and cultivation, as the law said. It helped develop the West and integrate it, with the help of the railroads, into the larger national economy. And the homestead work did its work well, getting somewhere between 270 million and 285 million acres into individuals' hands. In the West, about 2/3 of the new farms between 1863 and 1900 originated as homesteads. The Homestead Act transformed America's vast space into farms, public lands into private fields. It symbolized the nation's agrarian logic and idealized economic and social program. But that logic would founder on the shoals of a challenging environment. The West was often too dry or too mountainous to sustain small family farming, making the Homestead Act a poor fit in the Rockies or in the middle of Nevada. Although it worked in many places for decades, by the end of the 1870s, the nation's public domain stood at a crossroads. After nearly a full century, the national policy was found wanting, or at least incomplete. Worried about its ignorance of facts on the ground, Congress authorized a Public Lands Commission in 1879. One notable recommendation included withdrawing timber lands from sale, retaining them under federal control. Local settlers would be able to use the timber to build, but not for commercial purposes. The government could sell timber, but only on alternating sections, and must keep trees smaller than 8 inches to ensure reproduction of forests. These were not implemented. But this and other recommendations were nothing short of revolutionary. It's a radical break from the status quo. By the end of the 19th century, then, the public resources split into 2 tracks. On the one hand, the liberal policies of the government continued. In fact, homesteads increased. On the other hand, another policy framework edged in. Seeing wasteful use of resources and realizing that some lands could not sustain typical economic development, the federal government recognized it was time for an adjustment. And this became the conservation movement. And conservation reset the table. After traveling then those same pathways for a century, public land policy was difficult to divert. Difficult, but not impossible. Critics, reformers, and everyday farmers and miners and ranchers saw shortcomings in the existing system. They agitated for change that might establish a legal regime that more effectively facilitated the use or the protection of public resources. And furthermore, signs from the land itself signaled problems. Fires, floods, erosion, reduced ecosystems' resilience. This deterioration in nature was visible to the naked eye, and these factors pushed Americans together around their public land table to consider different ways to think about the nation's lands. In this new era, the table setting changed. It was as though the nation had set the small kitchen table for a family dinner, but guests arrived and compelled them to move to the larger, formal dining room that remained unfinished. The conversations about resources and conservation during these years cycled through waves of idealism and confidence on the one hand, and then through contention and debate on the other. Nothing reflected this more than forest conservation. A quick chronology. In 1873, the American Association for the Advancement of Science convened a committee to study forest protection. In 1875, the American Forestry Association formed. In 1876, Franklin Hough was appointed the first federal forester, and in 2 years later, 1878, Hough's report on forestry was published. Things were moving quickly, sort of. His report opened with his fears, having watched the wasting of supplies and the complete exhaustion of one forest region after another with an anxiety natural to those who look forward to the conditions that must necessarily exist in another generation and who feel the responsibilities of the present with regard to the future, Hough wrote. That eye toward the future marked one of conservation's most important insights. Evidence of problems accumulated and reform pulsed in the air, but Congress is a slow, deliberative body even when it does work, not a fast-moving one. In 1885, Congress introduced 6 unsuccessful bills to create public forest reserves, had similar results in 1888, in 1889, in 1890. Only in 1891, Congress passed a law that charted a new path forward. The president had the power to keep public lands covered with timber or undergrowth, whether of commercial value or not, as public reservations. That's it. That's the origin of our national forest system. It's a single sentence in a larger law. Within a month of signing the bill, President Benjamin Harrison proclaimed the first reserve, Yellowstone Forest Reserve, adjacent to the First National Park. By the end of 1892, 13 million acres of forest land were protected. Then the next president, Grover Cleveland, added another 5 million acres, but there were no guiding principles provided by Congress. So in 1896, the National Academy of Sciences appointed a National Forest Commission to investigate the western forest and recommend action. It proposed a strong federal force to protect the forests from fires and corporate timber theft. These were the twin menaces the American forests faced at the time, and it could only be matched by federal strength, which is a governing philosophy that was becoming more popular at that time. One of the commission's main recommendations led to more changes on the land. All lands fit for timber reservations should be withdrawn from any settlement or corporate ownership. That's what they urged. And when the report made its way to the president's desk, President Cleveland created 13 more forest reserves, amounting to slightly more than 21 million acres just before he left office. And Westerners saw Cleveland's actions as devastating. A California newspaper close to one of the Sierra Nevada reserves north of Lake Tahoe explained that those regulations would slow, if not wholly arrest, the development of the county's resources. The Seattle Chamber of Commerce likened it to revolutionary days. King George had never attempted so high-handed an invasion upon the rights of Americans, it said. The Rocky Mountain News claimed that theorists, enthusiasts, and cranks conjured up this idea opposed to actual Westerners who knew the conditions on the land. John Shafroth, a representative from Colorado, called conservationists brazen for their assertion of power over Western resources. This proffered guardianship over Western local interests we most earnestly protest against, he said. You may have the power, but it is not right. Such sentiment was widespread, if not universal, and versions of it would be heard continually. They're still heard continually. Opposition in Colorado was particularly intense. Frustrated, Coloradans simply ignored the rules. According to one historian, presidential proclamations, acts of Congress, and rules and regulations were all meaningless technicalities. The government could be damned. The forest reserves simply did not exist. Changing such attitudes and stopping action that flowed from them, such as cutting timber commercially, seemed beyond the federal government's capacity at the time. But changes were coming. Gifford Pinchot was elevated from special forest agent in the Department of the Interior to head the Division of Forestry in the Department of Agriculture in 1898. And when Pinchot took over the Forestry Division, it employed 60 people. By 1905, it employed 500. In 1901, Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he and Pinchot developed a close friendship and partnership rooted in conservation. In 1905, Pinchot became chief of the newly created Forest Service. 2 years later, in 1907, forest reserves were renamed national forests. To frame his new task, Pinchot wrote a letter of instruction to himself over his boss's name. And that letter established an ideal for the national forest system. And it guided the agency for decades, and it still matters. And it's worth quoting extensively, but I'll just paraphrase a few points. The Forest Reserve's lands were to be developed, to be devoted to its most productive use for the permanent good of the whole people, and not for the temporary benefit of individuals or companies. This department will always bear in mind that the conservative use of these resources in no way conflicts with their permanent value. You will see to it that the wood, water, and forage of the reserves are conserved and wisely used for the benefit of the home builder first of all. And where conflicting interests must be reconciled, the question will always be decided from the standpoint of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. This letter shows Pinchot's populism in standing for the whole people, but he also held anti-democratic tendencies with a strong belief that scientists and other experts could and should manage resources without input from politicians standing in as proxies for the people. The Pinchot letter thus encapsulated all the hopes and paradoxes and seeds for conflict that would challenge and characterize federal forestry ever since. But a new era had formed, and it was still sharpening its definitions. And according to this new governing vision, part of the nation's estate would remain public in perpetuity, managed by experts rather than open to individual or corporate assault. And this meant that part of the national table would be open to all, but that government gatekeepers would find more power to enact limits. Those restrictions kept those sitting at the table relatively uniform in perspective, seeing things through a narrow lens of interests. To be sure, debates were common. However, a host of alternative ideas remained uninvited to sit down. The public land system kept growing, and so did the confidence of its managers after World War I. Sustaining the environment and the economies that depended on public resources increasingly conflicted. Conserving and protecting natural resources remained at the heart of public land agencies, but so did maximizing them through intensive management. And so commercial interests sometimes forestalled greater reform. With few exceptions, those interests in the public lands came from a close social circle. Most all were men, most all were white, most all were professional in the agencies, most all were capitalists in the public, and most all agreed that natural resources were to be used to benefit society, and that could be calculated most simply by using economic measures. Managing rangelands had become a persistent challenge to the Forest Service, especially after World War I. Across the West, the grasslands and ranges showed unmistakable signs of decline. Fred Croxon, a district ranger on Arizona's Tonto National Forest, visited with longtime ranchers and reported what he learned at a grazing conference in the 1920s. According to the ranchers, compared to the abundant grasses of the 1880s, the range was at the ragged end of it all. Grazing had been present there for half a century. It had enriched some ranchers and established an important economic sustenance and cultural identity to many. But by the 20s, cattle and sheep had taken an ecological toll and were undermining the economy and the rangelands on which it relied. The national forests were not even the most controversial grazing real estate. Vast acreages of unclaimed land on the public domain remained largely unmanaged. The ranchers there used these ranges with few restrictions or rules, and the fate of these public rangelands became hotly contested. In 1929, President Herbert Hoover convened a third Public Land Commission. Hoover and the commission he created believed that private ownership should be the objective for grazing lands. This would be a departure from the widespread use of the public domain by stock growers who did not own it or pay for it. The commission proposed granting the public domain to the states, some 235 million acres, after which the states would auction it off to the highest bidder. The federal government, though, would maintain the subsurface mineral rights. The states balked at that proposal. Such a gift, thought Senator William Borah of Idaho, was akin to giving the states an orange with the juice sucked out of it. States accurately saw the public domain as largely a degraded rangeland with potentially huge burden to administer and costly to rehabilitate after decades of overgrazing. Utah's governor similarly pointed out that states controlled similar acres already that generated no revenue. Why would they want more? What western states wanted, he said, was federal range rehabilitation. Our ranges are being very seriously depleted and deteriorated, and they have got to be built up, and built up right away, or else they will be beyond repair. Although the results from the Third Public Land Commission might not have been what Hoover wanted, the commission's very existence was a sign that the status quo could not continue. Two landmarks demonstrated this continued problem with public lands grazing: the Taylor Grazing Act and the Western Range, a 1936 Forest Service study. Ranchers' operations were insecure because they did not hold rights to the land. And at the same time, government managers worried about declining range quality. Congress prepared to address this with the Taylor Grazing Act, which went into effect in 1934. The law provided federal oversight on millions of acres managed by the new U.S. Grazing Service. The agency would help rehabilitate range conditions to help the ecology. It would authorize 10-year permits to help the ranchers provide some stability there, and collect grazing fees to help pay for all of this. In deference to the livestock interests, the law's authority rested in local ranchers who constituted grazing districts. These grazing districts established rules and determined who could run animals where. And yet the Taylor Grazing Act did not do so much to address the deterioration and degradation of public lands, which was the law's first stated purpose, because the forces doing the degrading remained in charge. Advocates for the law hailed these local advisory boards as democracy on the range or home rule. And when the two main purposes of the law, stabilizing the industry and stabilizing the range, came into conflict, the grazing boards supported industry. In other words, the Taylor Grazing Act helped maintain the status quo. Improving the range's ecological condition happened haphazardly, mostly as an afterthought, and only when it did not interfere with profitability. At the same time the Taylor Grazing Act was going into effect, the Forest Service was preparing its report. The Western Range claimed that the forage on western rangelands had been depleted by about half, and the public domain ranges had declined by 2/3. One of its findings, for instance, said that 98% of the public domain, some 150 million acres, was eroding more or less seriously. Such issues and neglect posed a serious problem for rangeland ecology and any economy based on it. The prognosis appeared very poor. In 1946, as part of a general government reorganization, President Harry Truman created the Bureau of Land Management. And the move gave the BLM responsibility for 520 million acres of the West and Alaska, essentially all the public domain that had not been homesteaded or put in another public land agency. The BLM's land helped support numerous ranchers throughout the West, as well as diverse mining interests. So much so that the agency earned from critics the nickname the Bureau of Livestock and Minerals. At the time, grazing advisory boards remained central to the management system of the BLM, and livestock interests reigned supreme. One stark example from 1947 illustrates this power. Congress gutted funds for range management. As a stopgap, advisory boards gave $200,000 to pay BLM employees' salaries. In effect, the groups supposed to be regulated were being paid by the people they were supposed to regulate. The public land system was built then by the mid-20th century, and it had entered a new and important stage. With the system's pieces in place, the agency's missions became defined more sharply, and figuring out how the natural world worked had become high stakes because the land itself was suffering with deteriorating ecosystems. Meanwhile, corporate powers exerted their influence on the policies being adopted and implemented. All told, this meant the era was one of growth and emerging contention. And yet, political conflict remained comparatively mild, which can be explained by the near uniformity of those sitting at the public lands table making decisions. But just around the historical corner lurked bigger challenges when the table enlarged and became boisterous. In the decades after World War II, the public ventured into the public lands in unprecedented numbers as recreationists, backpacking into backcountry mountains, picnicking outside of metropolitan areas, worshiping at monumental scenic features, or just driving through. They grew alarmed at clear-cuts and crowds. They found tamed nature insufficient and wanted something wilder from the heritage of their public lands. And so the public organized and protested and called on Congress to rewrite the rules to strengthen wilderness and wildlife protection and to include citizens and scientists in decision-making. This helped motivate wholesale changes and transitions in policy between 1960 and 1980. From a table metaphor perspective, the biggest change was the number of chairs surrounding the table and who occupied them. Within the agencies, no longer did the engineer or resource specialist who occupy all the seats. Now, wildlife biologists and ecologists took up their chairs. And also, those extractive clients of these agencies, the mining company, the livestock operator, the mill owner, faced a larger gap between themselves and the table. To be sure, they still had the ear of the forest ranger or the grazing inspector, but that ear was not as close as the clients had become accustomed. Many traditional extractive users found that frustrating and threatening. Finally, and most importantly, in a democracy, the public had seats at the table. By the end of the era, every agency relied on new processes that required citizen input. What had been mostly unquestioned managerial prerogatives became subjected to public scrutiny, review, and litigation. By remaking the public lands table, the public, policymakers, and agencies made things far more complex and slower, but also more inclusive and democratic. Wilderness is one way to see all of this unfolding. I want to share in very abbreviated form 3 threats. First, dams. After World War II, dams were proposed and built with great frequency. Some of them were planned in remote, beautiful areas, including where they would affect national parks. One such place was Echo Park in Dinosaur National Monument near the Utah-Colorado border. The public protested this idea of a dam in this place that was administered by the Park Service. Howard Zahniser of the Wilderness Society helped lead the successful national public campaign to have the dam scrapped, and there were similar fights elsewhere. Second, reclassification. Before World War II, the Forest Service had set aside some areas within the national forest as off-limits to logging and managed them primarily for recreation. After the war, the agency reconsidered this and began reclassifying thousands of acres. A campaign in Oregon occurred at the same time as the Echo Park campaign. The Forest Service there proposed to cut 53,000 acres and open it to commercial logging. It had previously been closed to all that activity. And the public, both locally and nationally, opposed this, which surprised the Forest Service. There were similar stories all over the country. Third, park development. By the post-war era, national parks had seen better days. The Depression and war made up more than a decade of neglect. When Conrad Worth became the director of the Park Service in 1951, he sought to address the poor nature of the parks. He and allies launched something called Mission 66, an ambitious program that would celebrate the agency's 50th anniversary, which happened to be in 1966. The program spent more than $1 billion over the decade and tallied an impressive set of statistics. 1,570 miles of improved roads, 1,197 miles of new roads, 936 miles of new or improved trails, 1,502 parking areas, 575 new campgrounds, 221 new administrative buildings, 114 visitor centers, and so much more. This new infrastructure attracted more visitors. The year before Mission 66 began, 46 million tourists visited the national parks. The year it ended, 133 million visitors spent time in the parks. This full-scale development certainly helped many Americans learn the value of national parks and public lands, but it alarmed wilderness advocates who saw wilderness as a place for undeveloped recreation, for solitude, for an escape from automobiles. The Forest Service and the Park Service in these years seemed willing to allow such desecration, dams, industrial logging, mass recreation. Places many Americans considered wild and protective turned out to be vulnerable to despoliation. So a citizen movement proved necessary to demand better protection through what became the Wilderness Act after nearly a decade of political action, compromise, and delay. During the campaign in 1960, writer Wallace Stegner penned a famous, eloquent letter known now simply as the Wilderness Letter. To Stegner and countless other Americans, wilderness offered a counterpoint to the urban industrial civilization that ran riot over the land. Closing his letter, Stegner wrote, "We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in. For it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope." When the Wilderness Act passed in 1964, it presented something profoundly new in public lands history. It created the most restrictive category of land protection and immediately turned 9.1 million acres of national forest land into the National Wilderness Preservation System, which today has about 111 million acres. Within these designated areas, commercial activities generally were prohibited, no permanent roads or structures were permitted, and no motorized or mechanical transport was allowed. Importantly, to modify any wilderness area or create new ones, public hearings were mandatory. This procedure proved critically important, and it ensured new avenues for citizen input into public land management. And this was extended, this democratic access was extended in subsequent laws as well. So the metaphorical table by 1980 looked different. The table itself changed shape. What once had appeared to be land available to be remade into property, and then later as a set of resources to be managed carefully for use, now took on different purposes, including corners dedicated simply to wildness. And then business at the table changed as well. These shifts led to different questions asked, and it presented answers that would have been unthinkable in earlier times. Besides the new specialists at the table were the new seats for the public, and in real ways, these reforms firmly put the public into public lands unlike any time before. Not everyone was pleased. By sharing the space now, many people felt their influence diminished. Conservationists became adept at using the new tools to enact change on the land and in agencies to protect wilderness and wildlife from non-extractive uses of the public's resources. In reaction, those who favored economic development organized to reject this new order. Conflict was common. Big victories for either side were rare, and extremes became more extreme. At the heart of these questions were debates over the fundamental purpose of what the public lands were for and who counted in the public. The dissatisfaction that seemed ubiquitous spelled polarization that we're all familiar with today. The table no longer seemed a place around which Americans gathered to work out a public lands agenda that valued or even tolerated multiple perspectives. Instead, it was like a long picnic table with two benches further and further apart, where you could only see an opponent across a widening gap and not even hear those supposedly on your same side. All of these trends converged in a decades-long battle over the northern spotted owl and old-growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. After World War II, harvesting timber on national forests increased dramatically, and nowhere more so in the Northwest. Between 1946 and 1950, timber receipts tripled. Then, over the next 6 years, they tripled again. Before the war, national forests sold 1 billion board feet annually. By 1966, a record high of 12.1 billion board feet was counted. To round out these statistics, in 1989, 15.6 billion board feet was cut on public and private timberlands combined. Long a timber economy, the Pacific Northwest jumped significantly after the war, which pleased rural timber communities, but the toll on the land could not be masked forever. The Northwest forests that drew the most attention in this period were old growth. Douglas firs, the most dominant species in the region, could be 1,000 years old and 300 feet tall. A single tree might include 2,000 board feet. 7 trees were sufficient to build a house. From a traditional perspective of managers and timber executives, old-growth forests needed to be removed for profit and to make way for a faster-growing young forest. The growing clear cuts in the region consumed old-growth forests, leaving only about 15%. This fragmented, shrinking forest provided inferior habitat for the northern spotted owls and other wildlife. The story of science and law is extremely complicated here, so I'll be super brief. A new bipartisan and popular set of laws, including the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, required closer accounting for both nature and public involvement, and both of which opened doors for many, many lawsuits. Meanwhile, federal agencies, the Forest Service, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, spent much of the 1980s and early 1990s not following the law. Again and again, environmental organizations sued. And again, judges found that the agencies were in obvious violation, including things like ignoring their own experts. One should not have to sue federal agencies to follow their own laws. More protection spelled potential conflicts in the communities between environmentalists and local workers in the Northwest. Timber communities felt keenly the threat to their livelihoods that these legal requirements demanded. Corporations succeeded in framing the conflict as a battle between jobs and owls. Timber communities often framed the conflict in terms of outsiders and insiders. To them, they were the rightful beneficiaries of public timber. Not only should they continue to profit from the forest use, but they believed they improved the forest. One worker's comments at a public hearing in Oregon painted a picture of loggers working with nature harmoniously. Ask any logger who daily shares his lunch with a raccoon, a chipmunk, a raven, or even a doe and her fawn if he is destroying habitat or enhancing it. The timber industry has done more to perpetuate our natural resources than any other group I can think of. The clear cuts that increasingly dominated public forests after World War II told a different story. And if backpackers and activists could not speak to their personal economic stake in the forest, they could and did articulate a question about more fundamental rights and relationships. At the same hearing I just mentioned, another citizen said, "I don't feel any one species has the right to condemn any other species to extinction." The radical environmental group Earth First agreed and extended the concept of rights, as one of its members, Dave Foreman, explained. When we fully identify with a wild place, then monkey wrenching becomes self-defense, which is a fundamental right. Activists genuinely felt connected to these ancient forests, as they called them, and believed that they were theirs to protect, part of the public estate. The resolution was known as the Northwest Forest Plan, and it angered everybody. It opened logging in 20% of old-growth forests, something environmentalists felt betrayed by. The loggers and the timber companies, facing now a 75% reduction from the boom years of the 80s, felt betrayed too. A solution that was designed to please all sides pleased few. Elsewhere during these years, radicals on both sides made the news. Environmentalists climbed trees and sometimes spiked them to stop logging. They blockaded roads, they messed with equipment so it wouldn't work. On the resource side, extremists bombed federal buildings and called in militias to oppose public land agents doing their job. They occupied public land and buildings and prevented public access. They clogged the courts and the internet with wildly unconstitutional theories and undermined the very essence of public lands and democracy. Public lands controversies mapped onto larger political dynamics and fueled them in this, our age of polarization. Finding opportunities to slow or break the polarization down has been hard and rare. One reason is the stakes are high. The livelihood of timber communities and ranching families were at stake. On the other hand, the continued existence of species and a large percentage of Americans was also at stake, and a large percentage of Americans believed we did not have the right to behave in a way that would eliminate species. And so the protests on each side egged on the other and raised the ire of many. In most ways, this dynamic continues in American political life and on its public lands now. At the table where these debates occurred, a new configuration existed. While the public lands remained the object of attention, now those at the table increasingly sat not at a table of common concern where diverse ideas and perspectives aimed at the forests, parks, rangelands, and refuges. Instead, sides aligned and opposed each other, more like armies squaring off. The contests over these places were revealed to be about power more than the common good. A satellite image of southeastern Utah shows few roads and a lot of rugged territory. Since time immemorial, indigenous people have called this area home, and they remain deeply rooted in the fabric of life there. In 2015, 5 tribal governments, Hopi Tribe, Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, Pueblo of Zuni, and Ute Indian Tribe, joined in the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition to collaborate and to press for federal protection of nearly 2 million acres of this region. The land contains not only historical territory, but also sacred sites and an abundance of material culture. Worried about further depredations and destruction in the area, the coalition urged a solution. But the resolution came slowly and with controversy. In the final years of the Barack Obama administration, the Republican-led Congress attempted to craft a solution, although the committee in charge was chaired by a Utah representative hostile to federal conservation. The Intertribal Coalition, which by this time included support from dozens of other tribes and conservation organizations, was disappointed and opposed the measure, calling instead for President Obama to create Bears Ears National Monument. In the final days of his presidency, Obama did just that, setting aside more than 1.3 million acres, 500,000 acres shy of what the Bears Ears Coalition wanted. Nevertheless, the monument was a historic one. Consider the history that culminated in Bears Ears National Monument. Indigenous people shared a continent, holding land and its fruits in common, a gift from the Creator to be used and enjoyed by all. The conservation project has consistently eroded indigenous sovereignty. Still, despite all the ways that public lands had failed tribal people, the tribal coalition turned to federal conservation for support. Bears Ears became the first Native-initiated national monument, a point of pride and, for many, a hopeful sign of change. When Donald Trump became president, however, the new monument fell victim to an administration hostile to many public land initiatives. The Trump administration rescinded Obama's act and created instead a monument barely 200,000 acres a reduction of 85%. Later, guided by Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland from Laguna Pueblo, President Joe Biden restored the cuts, and Bears Ears has become the first co-managed site like this, a harbinger for the future. What happened with Bears Ears quickly became a larger symbol for public lands. Recently, Robin Wall Kimmerer, a botanist, writer, and member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, wrote an open letter to America, colonists, allies, and ancestors yet to be. In it, Kimmerer described the Wendigo, a creature that embodies the nightmare of greed, that cares more for itself than anything else, while laying waste to humankind and our more than human kin. You can find the Wendigo in cultures based on the commons where selfishness of one endangered all. In her modern retelling of the Wendigo story, Kimmerer cast President Trump as Wendigo in chief and excoriated him for viewing public lands as a warehouse of potential commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. And she specifically cited Bears Ears. Then she reminded us the public lands are ancestral lands first. To rethink our public lands as a home, as a source of identity that sustains communities and their history and their futures, as places where we belong as one of many communities, human and more than human, these are the tasks before us. What kind of ancestor do you want to be? Kimmerer asked the colonists. The public lands, she suggested, offered a place where we can choose to forego Wendigo ways and instead be a common ground out of which both native and newcomers come. The work of living within environmental constraints is among world history's most complicated and important tasks, and the exercise of democracy in a diverse and complicated society like ours challenges citizens and their elected representatives to set aside narrow interests and to seek a broader public interest. To make matters even harder, the 21st century includes global problems of climate change, biodiversity clashes, and political corruption. Moving toward the future, public lands can and should play a central role in combating these compounding crises. I want to return to Terry Tempest Williams, with whom I opened this talk. She wrote, "The integrity of our public lands depends on the integrity of our public process within the open space of democracy. To promote and maintain that integrity demands an honest reckoning with history, a past that includes both the exploitation of people and the land, as well as the protection of places and democracy." Kimmerer stated, "The very land on which we stand is our foundation and can be a source of shared identity and common cause." The task before us, then, is to ensure that our common forests, parks, ranges, and refuges scattered across the nation function as the public's land and not the preserve of one group or another, for that undermines the promise of a democratic and ecological citizenship that might bind the nation together. One place we might begin to repair the earth and our politics is with the public lands. Thank you.
As usual, we have time for some questions, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand and I'll run a mic. I do have to mention something. He talked about the timber wars in the Northwest. When I was a child, I grew up in Washington. We were on a family trip and we stopped in Morton, which is a logging town. And my older brother yelled out the window, "Save the spotted owl, save the spotted owl." My parents were mortified, so it's a little personal connection for me. Questions?
Would you comment on the Railroad Act of 1862 and how it sped and fragmented the concept of public land versus private ownership?
Sure. The Railroad Act of 1862 and a new one in 1864 and another one maybe 1872 was an enormous help to railroad corporations because the federal government gave millions and millions and millions and millions of acres to private corporations. The resources on those lands could be used by those railroads, or they could be sold off, and then the money from that could be used to help build the railroads. But and free loans. So it was enormous, some people would call that, I guess, corporate welfare in the middle of the 19th century to these corporations. But one of the things that ends up doing is it alternated, excuse me, I should give a little more background, along the route of the railroad, depending on which act we're talking about, I think it goes up to 20 miles on each, or on the total side, alternating square mile sections. So it's huge, huge amount of real estate, and that fragments the landscape. Eventually, much of that land gets incorporated within, say, a national forest. And so within national forests, there are these blocks that are owned by Northern Pacific, for example. And that continues still to this day. There are attempts to buy some of those in-holdings, and railroads have sold them to timber companies and that sort of thing. In Washington State, where I'm from, the largest timber sale, land sale ever was in 1900, where 900,000 acres was sold from James J. Hill, who you all probably know, to Weyerhaeuser, who I think was his neighbor. And so Weyerhaeuser has this great amount of land in Washington. But it made conservation difficult because of this sort of checkerboard pattern. Many times you'll be flying over the mountains in the west, and you'll see a checkerboard. I mean, it's just what it says, because the timber company land got cut, and the national forest land might not have gotten cut. And that, as you imagine, fragments habitat. It makes for managing difficulties because of agency agreements. Is that what you wanted me to talk about? Oh. Public corruption in 2 sentences about the railroads. The corporations got a lot of help from congressmen who they paid. That's 1 sentence.
Thanks for this. This is raising a lot of fascinating questions, but what I'm perhaps most curious as you look back on this trajectory is what effective models of federal enforcement look like, given that the history of public land is often characterized by these orchestrated spectacles of defiance by folks like the Bundys in Oregon and elsewhere. And with the new public land rules and things, enforcement seems like it's going to be a real challenge. So what tools, in your opinion, do you really see the federal government wielding most effectively to ensure that these rules are followed once they're established?
That's a really hard question for me to answer. And I'll probably skirt the answer because that's what I do when I'm in front of people and get nervous. Effective enforcement. I think the first thing I would say is the enforcement, historically, I don't think comes from the government. It comes from citizens groups demanding that the government enforce its rules. That's what that whole spotted owl stuff ended up being, was Seattle Audubon Society saying, the rule says this and it's not happening, make sure it happens. So part of it is citizen engagement to make sure that those things happen. And the other response that I'll make is not exactly what you're asking about, but maybe it's useful nonetheless. There have been, I didn't talk about it here, it's in my book, which I understand is for sale after the talk. There are a few examples in recent years of interesting coalitions of people coming together, groups you might not think of, like environmentalists and loggers in certain places, or environmentalists and ranchers in certain places, who on some issues are not on the same side and don't want the same thing. But they can find, sometimes in a third group or a third idea, a common enemy. It's a bad language, I don't mean to talk about it in those terms, but in that coalition forming, like on this issue, we care about open space, and so we want to stop this development. So we can collaborate, even though environmentalists might want ranchers to keep their cattle out of the streams a little more often than they do. They also don't want little ranchettes to be in eastern Oregon to develop. So it's not about enforcement necessarily, but in finding the common ground that allows enforcement not to have to be an issue, because there can be a common set of interests after. Again, I think I'm missing the issue you're asking about, but that's because I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. It's a good question. Because it's public lands, we have a say. We have a stake, and because the current situation is such where there's so many opportunities for input, but also then to say that procedures had not been followed, we have a chance to slow things down, which can be a real pain, and managers get really tired of that, and for good reasons. But that's one way to try to make sure that the rules are enforced. Thanks for the good question.
You've talked about the big institutional role, but I want to drill down to individual behaviors and accountabilities and how we use or visit or pass by our public lands. And I'm particularly interested as a hiker at all the trash I pack out whenever I go hiking, left over by other people, vandalism that I've seen on the Missouri River, and just a lack of knowledge about appropriate behavior and personal accountability to appreciate all that is around us. Do you have any comments about that?
Sure. As a historian, I would say, well, if we appreciated the history, people wouldn't do things like that. But sometimes I can be naive, perhaps, or idealistic. I do think, again, as a former professor, I believe a lot in education, as you might imagine. So however we can get the stories about why these places are sacred in a variety of ways to a variety of people, I guess I hope that if people can appreciate that, they would choose to act differently. But I don't know. It's a hard question, and part of it is a function probably of sheer pressure of population as well. I know one of the elements of the Wilderness Act, I'm not going to get the phrasing exactly right, was about being able to have the experience of solitude. And it's hard to do that when everyone wants to go. And when everyone wants to go, that's going to increase the trash that you're seeing. And I guess increased accessibility is a double-edged sword. You want people to go these places, experience these places, feel invested in them, but not so much. There's a book that describes the history of the Wilderness Campaign, and one chapter in the book is called Wilderness for Everyone, and the next chapter is Not Everyone at Once. And it's a real dilemma. But maybe sharing our own stories, sharing about how much trash you have to do, more people know about these things. I guess I don't know how to make people personally accountable. It seems a broader social problem. Yeah, it's a hard thing to do.
I'm looking at your quote from Terry Tempest Williams about the public process, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the intersection of the rulemaking process on the one hand, the court system on the other hand, and in regards to public lands, and are you optimistic or pessimistic going forward?
Oh, what a good question. It depends on what day you ask me whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, truly, or what time of the day, even. I think we have to hope, and hope isn't a naive thing. It's something you work toward. So I want to say I'm optimistic, although some days it's hard. I don't remember, you asked about rulemaking and courts. Yeah, so there's a variety of ways that we shape these laws, and some of them are shaped by what happens in legal outcomes in courts. Some of them happen through agencies making their own rules for how things go. The challenge with that is when new people are in charge of the agencies, they get to make new rules. And there used to be a time where it wasn't going to be that every 4 years we would just change all the rules, that they lasted a little longer than an administration. And I guess courts can weigh in on this as well. I guess that part of what you're describing too, though, is the different parts of our government, right? Rulemaking is part of the administrative or the executive branch, and then there's the judicial branch, and then there was a time when Congress passed laws. I don't know if you know that. It's called the legislative branch. One of the real challenges, I think, I may be getting off track, but maybe not actually. There are a number of important environmental laws that guide much of what we do that are more than 50 years old. And I think a lot of people think they're outdated or aren't working well. And it's really hard to get something to replace it. And so I think we have this patchwork of, well, I'll do this administrative rule that will maybe fix this one part of it, or we'll have this exception here in this case, and maybe that'll solve a problem. And meanwhile, our understanding of science has changed radically, so the Endangered Species Act can seem pretty outdated, and then all the lawsuits can seem like we're never going to get anything done. So now I'm sounding pessimistic about all of these things, but you know, that's the nature of complicated, wicked problems, they sometimes call them. So I don't have a solution. I think we have to choose optimism and choose hope and work for the better options. And I hope that we get updated laws that have as much protection that are built into these things that are 50 plus years old. That's one of the challenges. I think the people that say, let's talk about Endangered Species Act for a minute. I think there's probably some problems with it. Maybe it's a little outdated with our understanding of science and all of these things. And I'm pretty sure that whatever we would come up today in Congress would be worse. So do we try to reform it because and update it and risk losing it? Or do we keep trying to limp along with it and get the best outcome we can?
I have a quick follow-up question. So, day before yesterday, the Biden administration announced some new rules. Could you, from your knowledge of history, tell us what we should pay attention to in that announcement?
I can do this really well. I've been traveling for a few days, so I haven't read the news, so I can't comment at all.
That was quick.
Hi, just a comment and a question. The one thing we could do all here individually is eat lower on the food chain. We could do that and save some Great Plains ecology. The other thing is, do you have any example of other countries that have faced this challenge earlier in their advancement? You know, there's Eurasia, Asia, Australia, and South America.
I used to joke with my students that I was an American historian, so I didn't know about any other part of the world. And that's not much of an exaggeration. So I have not studied the equivalent to public lands in other parts of the world very much. Every country is going to be different based on their laws, but cultures as well. Canada's public land system is much more oriented toward the provinces rather than the national government, for example. That's the one I know best. But I don't think I could comment very knowledgeably about how to compare this with other protected lands around the world. Sorry.
Adam, there was a question online. I don't know if you'll be able to answer. They were curious about land-grant universities, and specifically they want to know about universities here, like the University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin. Is there a way to know where to find that information about the lands that were used to fund universities?
Yes. There was a project done maybe 3 years ago, I might not be quite right, called land grab universities. So if you searched land grab universities, you will be able to see all sorts of details about where the lands were taken from, how much money an endowment has made off land that was stolen from different tribal groups. It's an incredible database with some excellent reporting and stories that's just truly an outstanding, it's a prize-winning project. It's really good. Land grab universities.
One, thank you for coming. 2, I collect national sites as a hobby. And 3, I just returned last night from Florida, where side by side there's the Everglades, which is a national park, and Big Cypress, which is I don't know if it's a preserve, national preserve, or national reserve, but Big Cypress is very proud of the fact that it represents a coalition of folks at the table, to use your metaphor, of Native Americans, miners, environmentalists, recreationalists, all those people who had an interest at the table, and they're all allowed to do their thing in Big Cypress. And I'm just wondering, but then you say that optimistically, are they all going to follow the rules to play nicely in that preserve or reserve? And I'm just wondering if that is a tool for the future. I don't know when the reserves or preserves came up as a classification for public lands, and might that be a tool because there's a lot more activity allowed than at the national park Everglades adjacent to it.
Yeah, so there are a variety of, I focus just national parks, national monuments, national forests, the BLM lands and refuges primarily, but there are these reserves and preserves and cultural areas and historical areas that all have different rules. And I do think that they get those categorizations so that certain things can happen. Landscape that's close to where I live, when it was changed its designation, there was like, we're gonna have some wilderness here, we're gonna have a park here, we're gonna have a rec area here because we wanted to hunt there but not here. And so yeah, I think we can have different designations to allow different flexibilities and different uses. And I think I'm a historian, so I look backward, but if I look ahead, I do think that those sort of coalitions that you're describing, what's being created at Bears Ears, is going to be more and more common. And I think, I gotta believe, I'm invested in the metaphor, right? The more people sitting at that table where we can hear each other, and it starts with that Terry Tempest Williams quote, like we realized we all pretty much wanted the same thing. We didn't know that, but now we do. And when you're out there and you can hear other people, if you can hear other people and see other people, I think that helps move towards something that will be lasting. Maybe one side example, someone mentioned the Bundys earlier in their question. When they took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, what they expected was that rural Oregonians were going to rise up and say, yes, we're on your side. And what happened was they came to a community that had had a lot of conflict 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they sat down together and figured out how to work with each other. And so what they expected locally was, yeah, we're gonna rise up too. Like, you know what, we're neighbors. We work out conflicts by talking to each other. We don't like what's happening here. So that does show the power of being able to do that. Not that everything's always easy all the time and that they're all great friends always, but that can happen.
I think that's a really nice.
Adam, I have one from our Zoom audience. They would like to know, what has the impact been of having a Native American leading the Department of the Interior?
What is the impact of having Deb Haaland in charge? I think it's been enormous. Not only is she in charge, but we also have a tribal member in charge of the National Park Service for the first time ever. And I think, oh boy, I gotta be careful. I think wonderful things have happened. Some reversals have happened that have been positive. So there's like real practical on the ground things that have been important. I don't think you have Bears Ears looking the way it does with the co-management agreement that is in effect without Deb Haaland in charge. But they're also just real symbolic things that are positive about having this kind of leadership, so much different than much of the leadership in the Department of the Interior over the years, which has been quite a corrupt place if you look back over the century. So I think they're both symbolic and then real practical advantages. we think we're learning a lot more about and paying more attention to the longer tribal histories in all of these protected lands, which I think is absolutely essential.
All right. I think there we have a good place to wrap up. You're welcome to talk to Dr. Sowards. Make sure he gets up there so everyone has a chance to say hello and have a book signed. Otherwise, thank you for your support of History Forum, whether this is your first time or this is your nth time here. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back. Otherwise, stay warm today.